Good morning, it's 3 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. A bit of a weird one this morning, or at least it's going to sound weird for about the first 30 seconds and then hopefully it will become less weird. But I want you to focus for a moment upon the recent Supreme Court decision in the United States of America regarding abortion. I want you to just reflect for a moment on how earth-shattering that decision is and how completely at odds it was with what we presumed to be true. In the context of progress, we're not having a phone-in about abortion. We're having a phone-in about trade unions and industrial action. But here's the link. There's no such thing as a final victory. There is no such thing as a final conclusion. I've only realised this relatively recently. I'm not a young man anymore, but I had grown up presuming that some victories were permanent, some progress would be permanent. But just pause for a minute now and have a look around. There are things happening in this country that we used to warn of or speak of in slightly hesitant terms because we thought we might sound bonkers. There is a great line from Noam Chomsky, who has had a bit of a nightmare in recent years, but remains, if you look at the full canon of his work, an incredibly astute philosopher or social commentator or whatever you prefer. And he has always described the process of privatization as being one which sees right-wing governments deliberately running down publicly owned institutions to the point where they can turn around and say, well, we're going to have to privatize this. And that is now happening to the NHS. It just is. Yesterday's newspapers, we didn't touch on it on air, but the cat is out of the bag, if you like. The quiet bit is now being said out loud, where people are suggesting that the NHS should start charging, as in what you can pay should have an impact upon what service you can expect from the actual NHS. It's happening now. You look at that dreadful book that I used to quote from with a snigger, written by Liz Truss and Dominic Raab and Kwasi Kwarteng and a couple of others whose names, I think Priti Patel was there and Chris Skidmore, Britannia Unchained. A dismal, dismal text written by dismal, dismal people who are going to be in charge of this country by the end of next month. And who believe, among many other things, that you are among the laziest, the most idle workers in the world, and that you have far too many rights and protections. I'll say that again. They wrote a book describing you as being the idlest in the world and in possession of far too many rights and protections. Your life as a worker in Britain is far too easy and you earn far too much, would be a fairly neat distillation of the ideological beliefs of people like Liz Truss, Dominic Raab, Kwasi Kwarteng, Priti Patel and Chris Skidmore. And they're going to be in charge by the end of next month. And if you can reverse abortion legislation, and I know we're not in the United States, we're in the United Kingdom, but if you can reverse abortion legislation, you can reverse anything. And that is the very cheering and uplifting theme of today's programme, or at least the first hour or two of today's programme. You can reverse anything. Now, I'm not a historian, but I'm not thick either. And I think when you look at the broad sweep of the last 80 years or so, there is a shift from what you might describe as Victorian values to what you might loosely describe as post-war values. And the war was the reason for the shift. I don't, or possibly both wars were. Possibly a bit simplistic, but very plausible nonetheless. There was no way that the families who survived the two world wars, the Second World War in particular, there was no way that they would go back to the status quo that was in place before. They were not going to live in slums anymore. They were not going to work in dangerous factories anymore. They were not going to take their children out of school at 14 because they needed the wage. They or we were simply not going to put up with that Victorian notion of social hierarchy anymore, where, and thanks to the National Trust and others, you can still see what that was like. People would be living in houses the size of palaces, while those who built the houses or those who worked in the houses were working 364 and even on occasion 365 days a year. And they were frequently told that they were the lucky ones because they were in paid employment at all. This concentration of immense wealth among a tiny, tiny number of people. They're not sort of landowning aristocrats anymore, or not exclusively. They will be what we might call fat cats or plutocrats or even oligarchs, is achieved at an enormous cost to everybody else. And post-war, with the foundation of the welfare state, with the foundation of the National Health Service, with the foundation of a society in which people were protected and the rise of the trade union movement, everything got better. It never became perfect, but everything got better because we recognized the dignity of the individual and we recognized the rights of the humans in this country. The right to education, the right to healthcare, the right to protections at work against exploitative or even dangerous employers. You were protected at home, at work, at school, in hospitals, and it was a hard-fought battle. A hard-fought battle. But it's never won, you see. And this is, I think when I retire, when I hang up my headphones, it will be when I stop being taken by surprise by things, when I stop having moments of realization, when I stop feeling my comprehension of big issues improve, when I stop thinking, crikey, I'm still in the foothills of understanding stuff. As soon as I smugly and almost certainly incorrectly start thinking I've got everything sussed, then I'm off. You know, the kind of person who never changes their opinion about anything. A 20, 30-year window. Every strike is wrong. Every unemployed person is a scumbag. Every single mother is undeserving of. So you did these. I mean, very much a passport to prominence in British media now. Right-wing British newspapers. Think of a newspaper columnist. Climate change, industrial action, unemployment benefit, whatever it might, public sector, whatever it might be. There it is. Absolutely written in stone, and no desire to understand anything. I'll hang up my headphones when I stop being taken by surprise by stuff. And the biggest thing to take me by surprise in the last couple of years is that realization that no progress is permanent. No progress is permanent. And that's why I find Mick Lynch a uniquely fascinating character. One of his predecessors at the RMT, Bob Crow, was similarly engaging and compelling and indeed brilliant at arguing. But there's something about Mick Lynch which I think is even more impressive and important, and it's a sort of bedrock of intellectual sophistication. There is, I think, perhaps a more urgent threat to those victories, to those protections, to those rights, that is really coming into focus quite fast. Liz Truss essentially boasting about how hard she will work to strip you of your rights. And she is doing so with a fair degree of confidence that you will cheer her for doing it. That's why Mick Lynch is so fascinating. That's why when Mick Lynch pops up on the telly with some blowhard thinking that they'll be able to knock him in around the studio in an interview, he ends up wiping the floor with them because he understands stuff and he is motivated, I think, by a genuine sense of urgency. And that sense of urgency for me has grown in the last week when I look at Sunak and Truss embarking upon this bizarre attempt to compete about who can describe the consequences of the last 12 years in the most negative terms. I mean, it is actually breathtaking. There's never been a leadership election like it. The Chancellor of Exchequer and the Foreign Secretary competing to decide who is going to be the harshest critic of the government they were in until a month ago. It's madness, right? And one of the areas in which they are competing is this. Who's going to attack trades unions or workers most viciously? Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak? And Mick Lynch remains one of the only people who is manning the barricades. That's why this is such a fascinating week for me in British politics, and why this industrial action is about much more than railways. So I interviewed Ian McEwan yesterday, who is, I think, and this isn't a phone-in subject, he's got to be probably the greatest living British author. I mean, the man's an absolute legend. And sometimes I get starstruck when I do these interviews. It's not often with the people that you might expect me to get starstruck by, but and because I'm going to talk to Ian McEwan about Ian McEwan's books, including his latest, which comes out in September and is just a masterpiece, a beautiful book. And I sit there, I feel about 11, and I'm about to offer a thought on the book, something that, I thought this when, and you just think, God, please don't crush me, don't destroy, don't say, no, it wasn't about that at all. and his book speaks to some of the stuff we've just touched upon. It speaks to the question of progress. It speaks to the question of optimism and improvement. And it draws upon an experience that his own father had in Glasgow before the war, when dock workers would congregate at the docks and there would be more workers than there was work. You're familiar with this. It would fall to the gangmaster to decide who got work that day. But he tells a story that he was told by his dad, and it makes its way into the new novel, that I hadn't heard of before, and I should have done. And it's obvious, and of course it happened, but I'd never quite clocked that dimension of the practice. I just thought it was right. Okay, Keith, you can work today. James, sorry, mate, you can go back home again. John, you're in. Bob, you're not. I just thought it went like that. But what used to happen was that you would have is gangmaster the right phrase? I'm not sure it is. But anyway, the foreman, let's say. So the foreman would say, right, I've got 5 shifts today. And then the men would auction downwards who was prepared to work for the least amount of money. So, in modern money, it would be, all right, I'll do it for a tenner an hour. And then Keith would say, well, I'll do it for £9.50. And I'd say, well, I'll do it for £9, until you got to the absolute bare minimum that someone was prepared to work for. And do you know what fixed that? Trade unions. I mean, it's not even an opinion. It's just counting. That's all. That's what happened. Because you see it in business. I mean, look at somebody like, do you have to pick a sort of pantomime villain type of example? But you look at these companies or these individuals, whether they're running a water company while paying themselves millions of pounds, or whether they're running an on-site online retailer, their job is to make more money tomorrow than they made yesterday. That's all the job is. So if you allow them to take more money from their workforce for themselves and their shareholders, they will. That is what they're trying to call red tape, or regulations that we're going to abolish. And again, just as Liz Truss thinks with a degree of confidence that she can rely upon your cheers and shouts of support as she strips you of your own rights, so she and Rishi Sunak are fairly confident with the support of the right-wing media that they will be able to get you cheering and applauding as they give companies the right to take even more of the money that had previously made its way into the pockets of the workers. There is no permanent progress. Everything that you think was a victory for the people or the workers or labour against owner is temporary, and it can be clawed back. So, sorry, gangmasters, I think was the word I was looking for. I have a simple question for you this morning, but I am more than happy to take calls picking up on any of the points I've just raised, in support or indeed to challenge them. Here's one. I'm a union member, says this texter, but Lynch is a knuckle-dragging moron. And that's a perfect text for the question that I want you to focus on this morning. How does it work? How does it work? How do populations get persuaded that their rights and their protections should be surrendered? You look at the divide and rule that's going on now. Grant Shapps, a truly ridiculous human being who made his money using false names to sell get-rich-quick schemes on the internet. I'll say that again because, it's kind of significant. He used fake names to sell get-rich-quick schemes on the internet. He's Secretary of State for Transport, swanning around studios, talking about how 44K is the median income, and I think that's a pretty good... It's unbelievable. But people will be nodding along with it. So here is the question, all right? Simple question. How were the British people turned against trade unions? 0345 6060 973. And of course, the most powerful question of all, or the most powerful answer to that question, would come from you. Because this question could be, how were you turned against trade unions? You personally, what made you turn against trade unions? 0345 6060 973. How did it happen? And perhaps even more importantly, are you frightened now about the direction of political traffic? Are you wondering how the hell you were turned into somebody who's going to cheer the removal of their own rights? Because if you think what I'm saying is exaggerated or pie in the sky or a little bit daft, don't forget, we're talking about politicians who abolished your freedom of movement and then persuaded you to thank them for it. It is 21 minutes after 10, and you can tell how spooked they are by the fact that the Daily Mail today is going after one of Mick Lynch's colleagues who got promoted a few months ago and lives in a council flat. Apparently he should move house when he gets a job in the union, despite the fact that they used to do this to Bob Crow, a former head of the RMT. It was just a sort of breathtakingly bovine line of argument, but it works. And Grant Shapps talking about how they shouldn't go on strike because they were furloughed. Pardon? But anyway, how does it work? How have the British people been so successfully persuaded that organisations founded to protect them and look after them are somehow their enemy? Mick's in Ipswich. Mick, what do you reckon?
Well, hello, James.
Hello, mate.
I was saying to your researcher there, I was a truck driver for 40 years. When I began, you had to be in the union. Right. Now, some people would say that was oppressive, but to a certain extent, you were told what you could and you couldn't do. So, like when ships
that would be called a closed shop, I think, wouldn't it?
That's what it was.
Yes, and the logic, the rationale of a closed shop was that one out, all out, come one, come all. You can't negotiate separately. We negotiate for everybody. So you can't agree to do something that the bosses might want you to do, but your colleagues might not want you to do because that would undermine the workforce. It's not a perfect system and it has flaws and there are valid criticisms of it. But for people, dare I say, Michael, a little younger than you, I just wanted them to understand exactly what we were talking about.
Yeah. So I was saying, again, to your researcher, when we had as we still do, the shortage of truck drivers, if you remember, people were phoning in and saying, it's not just about the money.
Yes.
It is about the conditions.
Of course.
Well, as an individual truck driver, you can't say, I am not going to stay at that motorway service because if I get robbed, even though I've paid them 40 quid to pay overnight, they turn around and say, nothing to do with me.
Yeah.
We could say, we're not going to go to that group. Or when you go to an RDC of Tesco or Sainsbury's and they say, no, although you've driven for 7 hours to get here, you've got to sit in this hot little room on a plastic seat for 7 hours again while we unload you. So we could say, no, we're not going to go there. As an individual, and because I was still a union member when I retired and knew I had the backing of my union, I did say no. I would say to my boss, well, I'm not going to go and sit in that little room, so we can sort it out now or we can sort it out when I get there. And they'd say, oh, hang on, Mick, we'll change your job.
And of course, with a strong trade union and with a closed shop or just with a strong trade union, you would you would have every driver being able to avail themselves of that level of confidence and protection.
And this is why they hate Mick Lynch, they hate the rail unions, they hate the prison officers, they hate
doctors,
I'm trying to think
nurses,
of the other one, like power workers,
firefighters.
People who are together, who they can't order about unreason. I mean, I'm not saying that you can be unreasonable,
of course,
but so much of what workers have to do these days, people earning peanuts, when they're saying, "Oh, we've got full employment," to me, if you've got one of these jobs where you may do 3 hours today, but not anymore for another week, that's not a job.
No, I know it's not.
But it's counted as a job.
And you should be grateful for it. This is a beautiful illustration from your life, from your lived experience of the difference between a union and a non-union worker. And you don't have to answer the next question because you've already got a gold star. What is your understanding as you look back over that 40-year period? How have people, including people that were doing the same job as you, how have they been persuaded that unions were a bad thing and that unions were their enemy? How have we ended up in a place where a complete joker like Grant Shapps can pop up in a studio making rubbish jokes about how the unions are taking you for a ride and know that a significant part of the population are not going to see through his spivery?
I'm going to fall out with you now, James, because I'm going to say something that's going to annoy you.
Well, we'll see.
The times I've heard you say you have sympathy for the conned, but not the conner.
Yeah.
Well, I over the years, I've had failing sympathy for the conned.
Right.
Because, you don't have to have a degree in politics or social sciences to know these things. And yet we keep electing Tory governments who are quite happy to have millions of people who can't buy houses anymore, people living on the streets, can't get your teeth done. When you had all these things together, you're thinking it's always been Tory governments that have done it. And yet people either don't vote for them vote for them
or don't vote at all. Okay, my contempt for the comment.
You didn't have much of a choice.
I have. Well, I'm delighted to tell you haven't annoyed me at all. The contempt for the compassion for the con line is, for me, at least largely specific to Brexit. But I still want you to talk briefly or think briefly about other truck drivers who would have been on the opposite side of the argument. And I don't want to sound patronising to them, but what happened to them that didn't happen to you?
Well, I think, again, I'm on sort of several Facebook things for truck drivers, and you will get people say, well, the union were useless, this happened to me, and they gave me no support.
Right.
And my argument is, if you've got a bad union rep, and I used to be one at one stage, and I've been a driver's rep and all that kind of stuff, but being able to see it from both sides, if your union rep is useless, then you need to replace him. But what, again, a lot of people who even are union people want to do, they want to be in the union for the protection, but have absolutely nothing to do with it. It's a bit like government. I don't want to vote, but I want the government to look after me. Well,
so you need a little bit more investment.
What you and your other guys want.
Yes.
Then maybe you have to stand. And as I say, I've seen it from the other point of view. When I've tried to get management to do things, they won't do it. I've gone, and I'm talking reasonable because I'm a reasonable guy.
Evidently.
And you go back to the people and you say, well, they want us to do this. So I'm saying let's not do it. And they go, well, I don't know, and it's the money,
I get that. So you mean that, the idea that there would be rewards without effort is part of the problem. That's a very generous analysis of it. I'm interested equally, or possibly even more, in the rhetoric, in the manipulation, in the propaganda side of things. But you've gone in a more interesting direction in many ways and just focused on the individual. And why would that person there not appreciate the power of trade union membership despite being unhappy with their working conditions? Well, because the trade union has never done anything for me, or it let me down that time I needed them, in which case you need a better union. It shouldn't become an argument against trade unions in general. Mick, that was the perfect opener, mate. If I could have picked a caller or assembled one by committee or written a little computer program, that was absolutely bang on the money. You've got the perspective of 4 decades, experience of trade unions, and even though you might not realise it, given one of the things that you said, you do have a sympathy and an empathy for people who have been persuaded to, well, where are we again on this program? Describing people and reaching out to people who have been successfully persuaded to smack themselves in the face and then say thank you to the people that persuaded them. In this case, several Conservative governments and pretty much every newspaper in the country. That quote from Tony Benn that Sam has sent me in full. And listen, Mick Lynch and Tony Benn are both Brexiters. So there's no footballification here. You make a decision on an issue according to the issue. I disagree with them both passionately about the most important political event of 21st century British politics, but I can agree with them about a lot of stuff. And here's Tony Benn. Every single generation has to fight the same battles again and again and again. There is no final victory and there's no final defeat. I think progress has been made by 2 flames that have always been burning in the human heart. The flame of anger against injustice and the flame of hope that you can build a better world. The politics of people like Elizabeth Truss and Rishi Sunak and Dominic Raab and Kwasi Kwarteng and all the rest of them, it's a politics designed to extinguish those flames. And I find that frightening. It's 10:30. Rebecca Cook is here with your headlines. 10:33 is the time, and I just wonder whether we are sleepwalking into another catastrophe. In much the same way, and I know lots of people aren't ready to admit it yet, and that's fine, but in much the same way that Brexit just sort of crept up on us because of lies being very popular and very attractive, we suddenly end up becoming the only country in the history of the world to impose economic sanctions on itself via a referendum and to abolish our own freedom of movement and be ordered to celebrate it by the people that persuaded us. I mean, it's bonkers. But when Liz Truss starts boasting about how much damage she's going to wreak upon the hard-won rights and protections that some British workers still have, after, Margaret Thatcher and Rupert Murdoch joined forces in the 1980s, there was a hell of a lot less protection and fewer rights than there was before. But the workers that still have it are in the target, in the firing line. And I want to know why you have been persuaded. I want to know how you were persuaded that unions were the enemy and that the bosses, on the with the actual 6-figure salaries, or 7 figures perhaps more pertinently, that they were on your side. Chris is in Mansfield. Chris, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. Long-time listener, first-time caller. I'll try not to disappoint.
Welcome.
I work for a trade union. And I've worked for a trade union for less than a year, so it's been a bit of a learning curve for me, but I've learned a lot about how people interact with trade unions, how people not in a trade union seem to think we work. Yeah. And I think a lot of it is going back to what you said about Brexit just now. Sorry to mention the B word.
No, feel free. I think it's relevant. I think it's very relevant today because it's exactly the same people who persuaded us to punch ourselves on that side of our face who are now trying to persuade people to punch themselves on the other side of the face.
Exactly that. It's people during the Brexit referendum told us to not trust or disbelieve people who we would normally trust and that we would normally place our trust in.
That's correct.
So
those bloody experts, most obviously.
Exactly. Enough of those. There was a poll done, it was a while ago, but there was a poll done by Ipsos that said that trade union leaders were more trusted by the public than bankers, business leaders, politicians and journalists. All the people that hold the power and influence in this country. Yes. So if those people still want to grip on and retain their power and their influence, then you need an enemy, and that enemy is the exact person who is more trusted than you. It's those flipping experts. So how can people work together like a trade union? Yeah. How can people collectively exert their influence against the people that other people trust? So we've got the Daily Mail, running these attack lines on trade unions and telling untruths on a daily basis. And we've got business leaders and politicians coming out saying how dreadful it would be to give working people inflation-busting pay rises because it would, it would affect other people who aren't in trade unions. It's absolutely nonsense. And the reason that Mick Lynch is such a revelation is because he's quite happy to tell these people that it is nonsense. And just sort of an example for me, I work for a trade union that looks after public services.
Right.
And we are currently speaking to our members in health settings, mainly nurses, porters, caterers, office staff. And, we're talking to them about the potential strike action, balloting for strike action during the summer because of the lowly NHS pay offer.
Yes.
Somebody who was a patient in a hospital, because we were organising in a hospital last week, and a patient stopped by and said, this is disgusting that you're organising in a hospital. And I sort of took him to one side and said, talk to me about it.
Yeah.
Well, it's disgusting that you're talking, you're trying to organise in a hospital when there are patients and sick people here. These nurses should be doing their job. And these nurses want to do their job. Everybody who goes to work every day who's in a trade union wants to do their job. They just want to be looked after. They just want to put food on the table. We've got nurses in this country who are going to food banks.
And yet, it's the paltry wages of nurses are held up by people like Grant Shapps as a reason why railway workers shouldn't get an inflation-busting pay rise. So what happens? What happens when the nurses take industrial action? Because that's what fascinates me about these vampires, is that they'll be going, the train drivers, railway workers, what are they doing asking for a pay rise, the scumbags? It's ridiculous. And then the clock ticks, the hand ticks around the clock, and it's like, they're out there risking their lives, these people. Why don't you have a referendum on whether or not they should all get a pay rise? So every time there's a new negotiation, they should go back to them. I mean, it's just stupid arguments. And then the nurses are brought into it. And then when the nurses take industrial action, they turn on the nurses. So the question that fascinates me eternally, not just in the context of trade unions, but that's what we're talking about today, is it's so easy to see through. What has happened to that person in that hospital telling you off for trying to help nurses get a better deal in a hospital?
Because it's a constant thing. It's what have the Romans ever done for us?
Yeah.
And it's a constant thing of people being told trade unions, of course trade unions have their own members' interests at heart. That's what a trade union is. That's what it does. That's what it exists for. But it tries to then change the workplace mentality and the culture and the way that working people are treated. And then hopefully the wider world of work will take notice and just go, that's a pretty good idea to give people paid holiday and weekends and equal pay and health and safety regulation.
Yeah. You say it like that, it's actually hilarious. But anyway, here's Liz Truss to tell you why we need to abolish all of those things. And certainly if the company is planning on smacking you around the head with a wet fish, then we've got to make it illegal for you to object.
Yeah, exactly.
Happy days.
But people always want an enemy, and if you've got a really powerful enemy who people trust, you're going to do whatever you can to undermine that trust in them.
It's so bizarre, isn't it? We actually said several times, I wonder who'll be next. Now that the European Union can't be demonised anymore for the problems, but just because of this constant need for an enemy all the time, what will be next? Can't really go after the unemployed because there aren't any. It'll have to be the trade unions. It'll have to be what's left of the workforce that have actually some recourse to industrial action, because most of us don't. God dear. I wish I could put bets on my predictions sometimes. It would at least soften the horror when they come true. Chris, thank you, mate, and good luck in the job. 10:40 is the time. Dan's in Southampton. Dan, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How you doing? All right?
Yeah, pretty good. I'm genuinely baffled, though, by the willingness of people to turn on organisations that exist to protect them or people like them.
Yeah, so I'm a trade union member and have been now for close to 20 years. So I've taken strike action, I've taken industrial action in my workplace to defend my own kind of, terms and conditions and pay. Now, I always have to fight my own moral compass to do that, but I think it's the right thing to do. I think the problem comes from the age-old term divide and conquer. So central government, particularly Conservative ministers, demonise the unions and the members of those trade unions into members of the public, making them believe that we're the issue, that the issue comes from us, that we don't care about their safety, we don't care about them being able to get to work on the trains, for instance, which is the most sort of up-to-date issue that we're having with the trains, when in fact the issue comes from central government not looking after the terms and conditions. Now, I listened to Grant Shapps this morning talk about a median pay of around £43,000.
Oh, 44k, Dan. You've got to say 44k because you're Grant Shapps and you twang your braces and you say 44k.
So, again, what he's doing there is a classic case of divide and conquer. So he's trying to make people that are on less than that feel like an emotional, response in anger to the fact that the train driver's on that amount of money. Now, what we need to remember is that these people, it's not their fault they're on that money. They joined that industry and they joined that job and have set their whole financial infrastructure up in their home lives around that salary.
Of course.
So, they may have mortgage repayments that they need to meet. They may have bills that, they've decided to take on based on that salary. So when they're trying to rip up these terms and conditions and change the way that they're paid and the way that they work, it's not fair on these individuals. But it's very easy to blame the unions, blame the people that are taking this strike action to protect their terms and conditions. And like I say, anyone that might be on lesser salary would think, crikey,
yes.
why are these people complaining?
And this is the point. This was the point this morning where I felt a bit of an icy chill go down my spine because it's the idea of, particularly in London, which is such an expensive place to live. But,
absolutely. But I worked in London, so I understand that.
But the figure being thrown out by Shapps, who then throws in the figure for train drivers as well, even though they're not even on strike today, because it's 10 grand higher, so that works even better. Anyone on less than 50 odd or 60 odd grand is going to go, why are they going on strike? They earn more than I do. And I get that. I mean, envy is a very powerful emotion. But I think if somebody turned around and said, it's very hard to live in London on £35,000 a year, an awful lot of people would be up in arms. But it is actually true as well. So it's about what we expect by our quality of life. And that idea, I think Keir Starmer said something on Monday in Liverpool about that the harder you work, you're just standing still. The hard work isn't delivering anything anymore.
That is the problem. If you don't mind me just saying as well, we've just been offered a 2.5% pay rise, which we unanimously, refused, and we're now also having a conversation around strike and balloting for strike and industrial action. And I think it's worth just mentioning, we're demonising the unions. Now, my industry, we were. Our pensions were essentially attempted to be ripped up by central government, and that was found to be illegal and age discriminate. Now, we would never have had that outcome if it wasn't for trade unions. There would have been 30-odd thousand people that would have been illegally or had their pension illegally ripped up in front of them.
Wow.
So that isn't mentioned by central government, right? They don't want people to know that happened. And that was only because we had a strong trade union that went and fought in the courts and won that case.
And that's the point, isn't it? I mean, going to court is not something you can do as an individual. Is there a naivety? Dan? I'm quite a naive man, even as I get older.
I'm sure that's not true, James, but go on.
Well, I can be, because I always think the best of people. And so you sort of think, well, they wouldn't do that, or they wouldn't do this.
They do, and they did. And, if it wasn't for that trade union fight over a 2-year period, we will have lost that money. And there'd have been people now that weren't getting what they were promised and what they actually paid for. And that you've
got to fight for it. We're back to Tony Benn again, aren't we?
Well, it's safety in numbers, isn't it? And it's having those people, and the very fact that it's called a union. It's a union of people that come together to say, actually, that's wrong. We're going to fight it, and it was found to be illegal. The government acted illegally, and we'd have never been able to achieve that without a trade union
in a million years. And the age-old question of whether the government was acting knowingly or incompetently is irrelevant, really, because the victory needed to be won, and we're back to that Tony Benn quote. There is no final victory. There is no final defeat. You just have to keep fighting. I never thought that as a younger man. I just thought, well, that one's sorted forever. And it may even have been as recently as that abortion ruling in America that just made me go, nothing is certain, nothing is permanent, no progress is final. Thank you, Dan. 10:45. Amazing calls today. I glanced at the clock. I think we've only taken 3, but I'm not going to hurry people up when they're talking a lot more knowledgeably and sensibly than I can. That way madness lies. 10:48 is the time. Have a little listen to Liz Truss. I think we worked out earlier this week, didn't we? We talked about the Ricky Gervais film, The Invention of Lying. She has realised she can say absolutely anything, and she may not intend to deliver any of it. She's just saying whatever needs to be said to get through the next hour. Very Johnsonian approach to politics. But I think she means this stuff. I think the fact that they wrote that infernal pamphlet together, or book, Britannia Unchained, is it's like it's Maya Angelou again, isn't it? When people tell you who they are, believe them the first time. They believe that you are among the idlest workers in the world and that you have far too many rights and protections and that you, as a British worker, have it far too easy. And they're going to fix that. And here she is telling you again.
Big strike on the railways tomorrow. If you were Prime Minister, what would you do about it?
I would legislate to make sure there are essential services on our railway. It is completely wrong that the travelling public are being held ransom by militant unions. We can't allow that to happen. We need to make sure our essential services run. As I've said, I'm on the side of people who work hard, who go into work, who want to run their businesses. We can't see them hampered by the activities of these militant unions.
But the people who work hard as well, they work on the railways and for the train companies.
Well, those people are well rewarded for the work they do. And what is wrong is to try and hold the travelling public to ransom. I will take a tough line on trade union action that is not helping people get on in life.
Yeah, Mick Lynch, the boss at the RMT, has said that your attack on trade union and civil rights is the biggest since labour unions were legalised in 1871. He says that you are robbing working people of a key democratic right, and that if these proposals become law, there will be the biggest resistance mounted by the entire trade union movement, rivalling the general strike of 1926.
Well, I don't take any notice of these bellicose threats. I'm on the side of the travelling public who need to get into work to do their jobs. We're facing a global economic crisis. It's completely irresponsible of the trade unions to call these strikes at the time as we're seeking to get the economy going. And I will legislate to make sure that those core services are provided to the public.
So since 1979, a lot of trade union power has been diminished and diluted. They have arguably less power than pretty much any point in their history. Membership is a historic low. And the next Prime Minister, barring some unexpected event, the next Prime Minister thinks they've got far too much power. And lots of people in Britain, nowhere near as many as she thinks when she talks about the travelling public all being opposed to the industrial action. She's palpably wrong. But millions of people in this country think that she's on their side as she attacks their neighbours. And I don't know how that happens. How does that happen? 0345 606 0973. Paul's in Bath. Paul, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James. Yeah, good morning. Just really 2 points, and one's from quite some time ago, but I was in the armed forces as a very young officer for about 8-10 years. And I was on a short service commission, which effectively means, for gig economy. I didn't know this at the time, but I was made redundant without any redundancy pay. I was actually just summarily dismissed because they decided to remodel and reshape the armed forces for the future. And this goes on all the time. So I don't really buy the argument that you can't change someone's terms and conditions when the current climate, technology, advances, things are happening and changing all the time.
No, but you said you didn't realise what your terms and conditions were.
Well, I was 19 when I signed up for the army. Yes. I got commissioned as an officer. I thought I was in for life, and I committed my life to the army. I went on some pretty horrendous operational tours. No pay rises, no ability to strike, no crown immunity.
Yes.
No, all these things happened.
And no rights or protections when they decided to get rid of you. So I'm not quite sure what you're. Are you on
2 weeks' notice?
Yes, I know that's appalling. Are you suggesting that because that happened to you, you're in favour of it happening to other people?
No, but what are you suggesting then? I'm suggesting that things do change, and you have to sit down there at the table and negotiate and compromise both sides.
That's what they're doing. You didn't have that right, and Liz Truss is pledging to take that right away.
No, and I don't agree with that. But what I do agree with is the idea that there are reasonable things happening right now that people are making big sacrifices for in the private sector as well. So the idea of just saying we're going to strike and make your lives a misery unless you give us more money, when I may not be
they just want a pay rise that recognises inflation, because if they don't get a pay rise that outstrips inflation, then every year they're earning less than the year before.
So in the private sector, I've not had a pay rise for 8 years.
You are doing that thing, Paul. Paul, mate. You may not realise it, but you are very much, and I'm very grateful to you for ringing in, because I think you speak for millions. You're jealous.
Not so much. What I am concerned about,
absolutely, and categorically, you're jealous. You're literally telling me that you got shafted by your employer in the past, so you don't see why these employees should have any right of recourse with their employers. They should suck it up just like you had to. And now you're telling me that in your current working life, you don't have protections, you don't have a union speaking up for you, so why the hell should the railway workers have one?
No, honestly, no. I don't believe they shouldn't have a union, but I believe the union are wielding too much power in the sense that they could bring a country to its knees pretty much at
How much
will.
power do you think they should be allowed to have, Paul?
Sufficient to sit around the table and negotiate and compromise on behalf of their members.
And if the employer doesn't compromise?
Say again?
If the employer doesn't compromise, then what should they be allowed to do?
Then there should be recourse to a higher body, to an arbitration committee that says you're being unreasonable.
The government's refusing to speak to the unions.
And they're at fault as well. And we shouldn't be voting for a government that don't sit around the table.
Unfortunately, that's the government we've got, and that's the government that the unions have to deal with. So if they can't go on strike, what can they do to stop employers treating them like you were treated as a young man?
Well, I'm not
sure. Just
Paul,
pause for a minute. Just think about the question, Paul. No, wait, because I don't want the railway workers to be treated like you were when you were slung out of the army.
No, I agree.
All right? So if they're going to do that to a workforce, what can the union do to stop it from happening?
Well, I mean, the only recourse other than strike action would be some case of law that protects them, that forces the government to get around the table and negotiate.
Liz Truss, I just played you a clip of Liz Truss promising to water down the law that currently protects workers. So in the world we live in, a trade union that wants to protect its members from being treated in the way you were treated as a young man, what weapon would you allow them to have?
Well, I think we have enough frameworks and structures in our country now to. But
we clearly don't.
Sit around the table and negotiate.
But we clearly don't, because that is what they are doing. So when the employer,
we need to go to the Supreme
you keep
Court
repeating yourself because you know, Paul, that the only truly meaningful recourse they have is industrial action, and you've realised that in the course of this conversation. And I don't want to embarrass you by labouring the point. But that is precisely what we've been talking about all morning, because you didn't get looked after when you felt you should have been. You've been turned into a person who doesn't think other people should be looked after either, because you can talk all you like about arbitration or compromises or legislative frameworks. This is a government, and Liz Truss's government is clearly going to be committed to this, that wants to strip away the protections that they already have. And you've been persuaded that that's a good idea, largely because you don't have any yourself.
Okay, I think it's slightly over-pegging it there, James. I don't believe they should.
Everyone's listening.
That there should be a structure where the government don't have the ability to say we're not talking to you, and that the unions don't have a retort to say, well, in that case we're going on strike. If that's the only option, that's not adult. That's not sensible. We need to have a different kind of structure that says.
You see, you're so nearly there. Then, so I mean, here's the point: if an employer is as inconsiderate and as unreasonable as the army was to you, what could, if all of you and your comrades were in an organisation dedicated to protecting you and your comrades from unfair employment practices, from exploitative employment practices, what could you do to fight back?
Yeah, okay, so let me just be absolutely clear. I don't think I was exploited in that sense. I mean, I was on a contract that I should have known better. I should have known at 19 what my employment contract was.
Yeah, so
my
but
point of that, James,
what could you all have done collectively together to resist unfair treatment? What would have been the most effective weapon in your arsenal? An unfair treatment from your employer directed at a small number of your comrades, but you're all going to join forces to resist it. What would be the most effective way of resisting it, Paul?
Well, I don't agree with it, but it would have been to lay down our weapons and not do what we were signed up to do. It would be to completely, to don't turn up to work.
So so the only recourse to justice that you had is something that you don't agree with. I mean, the army is a special case, of course, but you wouldn't extend that to railway workers. If your father's on
an operating table and all the surgeons go on strike, what do? Do you think, oh, that's fine, they need more money because they're working really hard, but my dad just died of a heart attack on an operating table? That's where I don't agree. If nurses can go on strike...
We both know, don't we, that they're not going to go out on strike in the middle of an operation, Paul. So again,
okay,
I don't want to.
cancelled
I don't want to.
operations,
I don't want to embarrass you, but we're talking about railway workers today, and you have, and I think still, I'm not going to be able to quite crack the final nut here. But your opposition to industrial action is built upon envy, because you don't have recourse to those sort of protections and rights. And here's the thing that perhaps I should have said a little earlier: I think you deserve them too.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure that would work with the armed forces if they
You're
are
not in the
on
armed
deployment
forces, Paul. They threw you out because you didn't understand your terms and conditions and you didn't have a union. I think you deserve them too. And the mystery of today's phone-in is why you don't think you deserve them.
Well, but, you sign up to a job, you do the job as best as you can, things do change, and you have to adapt. And if that means you need less soldiers and less officers, then some have to go.
You're not in the army anymore.
No, but are you referring back to that situation?
No, I'm not. I'm talking about you today. Today, right now, I think you deserve the protection and the dignity that a union can afford, and I'm very, very sorry that you don't have it.
Okay. Can I make one very final point? Because I did say two. And the last one is this, and I may have the exact figures wrong, but my understanding is a junior doctor does about 7 years' worth of training and comes out on about 40 grand a year as a junior doctor in a ward somewhere. Something like that, I'm led to believe, and you may tell me it's a lot less or a lot more, but I'm pretty sure it's about 40 grand.
Well, and your point
as I understand it, an average train driver's on about 48 grand. They want more.
We've already covered this. Number one, the train drivers aren't on strike today. And number two, that is an argument for paying doctors more, not for paying railway workers less, Paul.
Why is it not the other way around, though? Why is it not that the doctors are getting enough and the train drivers are getting too much? How is that not a valid argument?
Because the doctors don't have the union strength that the railway workers have. And just like you, I wish they did, just like I wish you did. Do you see it now?
Is £48,000 the right amount of money?
You just made that number.
You just backwards and drive a train.
Oh, and now you're getting that. So now we're going down. Now we're going down the Rupert Murdoch route. I mean, what do you want me to do? Remind you of the recent rail disasters where people have died? Well, you pretend that it's a trivial job. Just accept the generous.
No, James. No, I'm not saying
just accept the generous and what you are. You're just saying pushing a lever all day long. That is a description of something trivial. All right, I've done my best. I've done my best, Paul. I wish that you had access to the sort of rights and protections that railway workers have, and I hope that soon you'll see that wanting them to be stripped of theirs won't make you feel any better at all about your life. 5 minutes after 11 is the time, and I think most of us have been there, depending on your age. I think we're now entering into a period of British history where you can't start talking about the winter of discontent every time anybody suggests that they might need to stand up to their employers. But trade unions swing too far. History's a pendulum. We've talked about this a million times on the programme. History is a pendulum. That's weird, though, isn't it? Of course, we've talked a million times about how history is a pendulum, and yet I'd never realised that no progress is permanent. Just a bit slow on the uptake sometimes, I suppose. But there it is. You look at the post-war period, you look at the formation of the welfare state and the NHS, you look at the successes of the trade union movement. You look at some of the pictures of working practices in the 19th and the early 20th century. You look at Victorian models of society, and you think, well, we'll never be like that again. We'll never send children up chimneys again. I should stop using that as a figure of speech, shouldn't I? Just in case Liz Truss decides that could be the way to win over a few more votes in the shires. But no progress is permanent, which means that the trade union triumphs of the last 100 years are impermanent, vulnerable, fragile. Mick Lynch is of the view, as are many trade unionists, that they are under mortal threat. Liz Truss seems to endorse that fear, endorse that view. So how come millions of British people are on the other side of the argument from the organisations that exist to protect them? And I think Paul, whether intentionally or not, was a brilliant, brilliant contributor to that conversation. 7 minutes after 11 is the time. Stuart is in Malaga. Stuart, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James. I've spoken to you before when I broke lockdown rules, so I can't say first-time caller and all of that jazz. But I think the power of the unions has been diminished over decades. Yeah. I mean, I think the rules have changed, the regulations have changed. I mean, going out on strike now is you have to get 50% of the members to vote to go out on strike. If that 50% decide they don't want to go out on strike, we have another vote, and on that another vote, people just won't vote. So they she's going to bring it down to
40%.
Is she?
Oh, no, sorry. No, hang on. No, it's currently 40%, and she's going to push it up to 50%, I think.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Well,
sorry. Is that what you said?
Our union... No, our union is... So I'm in a university, and our union is 50%. And I think what happens is members start to ask, why am I paying this money?
Yes.
So I pay like 20 odd pound a month.
That's a brilliant point. The more that you denude the union, the less attractive membership becomes. The less members they have, the less power they... Oh, my days. An hour and 8 minutes into it. You straight to the top of the class, Stuart.
Oh, I was good the first time because I was the one who rung up and said I broke the lockdown rules. You were like, waiting for you all day. So I was like, oh. No, but I mean, I'm coming from a family that's very, very socialist. I was taken to marches in the 80s for the NHS in the centre of London, with thousands of people out and marching. And now our union, even when they went out on strike about a pension, a few months ago, we managed to get like 51% voted, right. So therefore we could go out and strike. And literally half the people who were in the union then didn't actually undertake the industrial action. We had the student union backing us, saying, no, we agree with lecturers, etc., going out on strike. And then we had thousands of complaints from students saying we didn't get our lectures. This is disgusting. We want a refund. So again, it's been that sector has been commercialized. So then the users of the service are naturally turned against the unions. And so we've got another generation
coming up now of graduates who are going to think that unions are the enemy. I mean, listen, absolutely. Just to clarify a few points, this is really helpful, actually, because there's no point in being a rose-tinted admirer of every trade union action ever. So I quite like the idea of mandate being enforced. If you've got a union with 1 million members and only 8 of them vote for a strike, it seems to be a little bit ridiculous that all million are then required to put their tools down. But the chipping away is, of course, going to have an impact upon membership. So you make a union less powerful by degrees. The less powerful it is, the less attractive membership becomes.
Well, and the problem there is, you see, is that so the committee in our university, they're all volunteers. So there's no paid union rep because they don't get enough membership money to pay for a union rep. So when I worked in the local authority, we used to have a paid union guy, and that was his job to manage the union, run the union. Move on 20 years, you're into a sector now where literally people are doing it for free. Yeah. And so, again,
because there isn't the money to pay them, because the membership has diminished so much, because the power has been eroded so effectively.
Yeah. And that's why the RMT is probably one of the last really strong unions.
Yes, but that's the whole point, isn't it? That's the whole point. This is again.
They're after them.
Of course they're after them, because how dare they? How dare they actually have the... I mean, it's a weird parallel, and you'll laugh at me, but it's a bit like Twitter. I've only just realised why the Daily Mail gets so cross about what they call social media warriors on Twitter, because they think that the power should reside only with them. They hate the idea of workers actually being able to land punches upon employers, just as they hate the idea of ordinary people who've managed to accrue a few 100,000 or tens of thousands of followers on Twitter. How dare they be able to embarrass my editor or make me feel stupid? They're just ordinary people. They're not part of the plutocracy. They haven't been anointed by some newspaper owner. It's a weird parallel, that. I probably won't be using it too much, but there is something there about knowing your place. And both social media and trade union action allow ordinary people to band together and find much more power together than they could ever have apart. And that's why, as you say, that's why they hate it.
Well, it's the divide and conquer point that was made earlier this morning. That's absolutely spot on, and it always is. Look, keep up the good work.
No, and you. Thank you. Enjoy. Are you on holiday?
Yes.
I love
holidays.
that. I hope you're not getting into trouble with anybody for still tuning in and even ringing in on your holidays. I think it should actually be encouraged. You can't take a holiday from reality. Well, unless you're Liz Truss, in which case it's more or less permanent state of affairs. 12 minutes after 11 is the time. Jonathan is in, I'm going to go for Saint-Gervais-les-Bains.
Spot on. Very good translation.
Crème de menthe. What would you like to say?
Long time listener, but normally on catch up. So first time caller. Funnily enough, it's lucky it's come today because this is sort of I'm a novelist, and I've literally just written my latest novel is called Undercountry, and is about the miners' strike substantially. And I would say that this goes right back to then. The irony of Liz Truss cosplaying Thatcher. Is that they're trying to also resurrect the very same battles that Thatcher, and battle's the right word actually, not even because of the Battle of Orgreave, where the miners were routed by the police and literally horrific events went on, but there was a militarisation that went on throughout the whole of the miners' strike, where Thatcher actually called them enemies and extremists and enemies of democracy. A little bit. There's a lot of Brexit parallels. A little bit like the enemies of the people that's been recently popularised. Actually, they did the same thing with figures as well. The Thatcher government got all of their compliant media to say that the mines were costing £1,300 million a week. They put that figure everywhere. They didn't quite put it on buses, but they put it very much into the minds of the public in the same way. Whereas, in fact, virtually all of that was already sunk costs and the costs of closing down the mines. And what they spent on policing the strike, on destroying the strike, and what I would say was the first part of crushing union power forever, they spent £8 billion, which, today couldn't even tell you what that is in today's money. £65 million a week just on like policing it. 14,000 police officers were completely taken off other duties, just paid in cash, paid in overtime, given military training, and yet the press called it Arthur's army, as if it was the miners who were the military force.
And when you say the press, I mean, we are talking here about the period in which Rupert Murdoch began to exert his stranglehold upon British democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. He was a fundamental player in that battle. It was. Sorry.
How do you account? How old are you, Jonathan? Because you sound younger than me.
I'm 48.
Oh, we're more or less the same age.
I don't think I'm much younger.
No, we're more or less the same age.
You wouldn't tell from my accent. My mum's actually from the northeast of England. So,
right.
I spent a lot of time in County Durham.
During the strike, my old man was covering it. My old man was covering it for the Telegraph. He wrote.
Oh well.
So it was. We're probably slightly more informed than people of our age who didn't have a personal connection to it. But of course, millions of people did have a personal connection. How do you then? And I'll ask you in a moment what the book's about. Although we'll have to be brief because I'm already late for the break. How do you account for the successful persuasion processes that have people cheering the destruction of organisations designed to help them and or their neighbours?
It's a process of othering. It's a process. It is a process of propaganda. It's a process of trying to persuade ordinary working people that these other working people are trying to nick their stuff. Or, as we've got with the train drivers now, as one of your previous callers said, they came up with, during the miners' strike, they came up with this figure of what the best paid miner in the most productive mine in the country after production bonuses in a year where he worked every waking hour and all the overtime he could get might allegedly earn, and then use that as a figure of what
saying Grant Shapps out.
The ordinary miners were getting. Exactly. And obviously that came up with this staggeringly high figure, and ordinary working people were like, well, I'm not getting that driving a bus, so why? Or ironically, probably driving a train back then, or even as a police officer who's getting special crowd control training so that I can crush these people.
Wow. Although they used to, didn't they? They used to wave their overtime in the faces of the miners. And miners, by this point, were hungry. I mean, families were struggling to eat in some communities, and the police would turn up with their overtime pay packets and wave it in the faces of the striking miners. which was sort of
They did.
Thatcherism in a nutshell. Briefly, Jonathan, what's the theme of the novel?
So the novel's called Undercountry, and it's kind of literally undercountry in terms of underground.
Yes, I had worked that out, mate. Thank you.
Sorry. But also kind of about underclass, because it starts with the mines, but it actually goes through some of the left behind coastal towns in the UK as well, and then returns back to a pit village in 1998 and looks at the aftermath of what happened to those communities once Scargill was proved right, because all the mines were shut down and nothing was put in place, and those people were left with nothing. In fact, many of the pit villages were deliberately defunded in the assumption that people would just up sticks and eventually move away. But the miners couldn't, because they were trapped. Most of them used their redundancy money to buy suddenly worthless houses and to pay off their mortgages. But then they couldn't sell those houses on, so they were literally trapped in those communities forever.
I shall look out for it. It's Jonathan Trigell. Is that pronounced correctly?
That's pronounced very well as well. Thank you.
Look at that. You see, so and Undercountry is it's out now. I noticed Boyer was yours as well. I saw that film. I haven't read the book. That was the Andrew Garfield film, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So you're a bit of a superstar then. You're very modest. You see, if it was me, I'd have come on and started laying out all the awards and giving it large about the movie deals, but you didn't. You just very modestly came on and explained your qualifications for contributing to this conversation, for which I'm very grateful, Jonathan.
Well, thank you very much. Very great pleasure to be on.
Undercountry by Jonathan Trigell is available now in all good bookshops, and I imagine in mediocre and not very good ones as well. It is 11:18. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. 20 minutes after 11 is the time, and in a way it's quite encouraging, isn't it, to discover, or to realise is probably the better word, that no progress is permanent, because A, it helps you guard against complacency, but B, even when things aren't going well, you can't afford to be too downcast. You've got to keep fighting for what's right. And in this case, what's right is that working people have some protection from potentially exploitative employers, and there are some mechanisms in place to ensure that they get at least a semi-decent slice of the pie. You're never going to stop the owning classes from taking the huge proportion of the pie that is made by the workers, but the workers should have some methods and means in place to protect the slice of the pie that they get. And you learn, or you possibly knew all along, well, I learn as I get older, that a significant part of right-wing political ideology is dedicated to removing those rights and protections, and that workers should actually be competing with each other over who's prepared to work for the least, which happened on British soil in living memory. You'd be, well, I'll do it for less if I can have. I mean, full employment at the moment largely guards against the worst excesses of that sort of thing, but that won't be permanent either. So how has the country become a place in which trade unions have become an enemy? Trade unions that are champions of working people are routinely derided by working people. Why? How? What does it mean? Or, of course, as many of my callers have done, make a broader contribution, make a bigger point. I'll read you this from Bev, because I remember Bev. She said, I spoke to you recently about the sort of things my partner did as a railway worker, including checking trains after fatalities. Those who don't agree with others don't understand how their workplace protections have been gained by unions. What scares me is Liz Truss wants to get rid of regulations that protect workers. It goes back to the Peasants' Revolt, when workers stood up against barons. Unions are not about socialism. They are about democracy, allowing representation for the many, not the few. And I guess if you're part of the few, you can be persuaded to hate the many, until the point where the union becomes the few and the ununionised are the many. And that's where we are now, and that's why Mick Lynch, I think, is fearful of an existential crisis for the trade union movement. And language is so important. So this is a great text from Bev. Thank you. She says here, what scares me is Liz Truss wants to get rid of regulations that protect workers. But they'll call it red tape, you see, to make you think it's a bad thing. I'm haunted by Grenfell Tower in so many ways. But whenever I hear them talking about a bonfire of red tape, I almost gag a little. I think in the context of the Grenfell Tower tragedy, to talk about which was in large part a consequence of poor regulation, and not enough red tape. To come out of that tragedy and still be talking about the need to have a bonfire of red tape as they continue to do, I find it gross, actually. Because red tape, it's a phrase, I mean, they've told you that Brexit would reduce red tape. Tell that to anyone trying to get through Dover at the weekend. But they use the phrase red tape to make you think that this is bad stuff. We should have a different name for it, shouldn't we? We should. What would be a better name? We call it bandages. Trying to get rid of all the bandages, or trying to get rid of the protections, trying to get rid of the rights. Call it red tape, and they think it's a negative. It's a positive, usually. There's always going to be some rules that are a little bit over the top. It's why that phrase exists, about rules being made to be broken. But rules regarding, I don't know, fire escapes, cladding on buildings. Remember when Rees-Mogg came up with his wizard list of Brexit benefits? And it was, well, if we leave the European Union, we could do fewer tests on electrical appliances. We opened up the phone lines, and it was as bad as we feared. You can do fewer tests on electrical appliances. The tests are designed to make sure that they're not going to hurt anyone or burst into flames or electrocute a worker. Yeah, we need fewer, though. Don't need so many of those. Cost so much. We're spending money making sure. We just wait until they're dead and then change the rules. It's incredible, right? And it's everywhere.